And right now I'm going to invite you, we're going to head into a message that Mark has recorded for us as we continue on in this series, Now What? Where he will be talking about what do we do when things are out of control? And what do we do when there seems to be injustice in our world? So will you join us in watching that?
Well, thanks so much, Daniel, and thanks for continuing to join us in our series, What Now? How to not just survive, but to thrive in crisis. And today we're talking about what to do when you feel out of control. Because crisis, whether the crisis we're in now or any crisis you face in the past or face in the future, often leaves us feeling completely out of control and upside down. Because in times of crisis, we become aware that we may be only one breath away from a life-altering or life-ending event that is outside of our control. Some of us, we've lost control. Our favorite spaces in this season are no longer safe. We've never not been able to hug our mother on Mother's Day. This year we did. To be separated from loved ones feels out of our control, and to wait for the news to tell us when we can. That some of you are feeling like you've lost control. You worked so hard for this job. You studied at night. The kids were finally in school. You were finally back at it. And now the kids are home and you're trying to decide, is it your job that stays or my job that stays? You feel out of control and you feel like it's a decision you should never have to make. Some of you have lost control over your community and the freedom to worship the way that you want. In fact, the way that we worship seems to be endangering our most vulnerable. To gather in large spaces, to gather indoors, and to sing out loud. To be able to be surrounded by our loved ones is no longer an option in our last moments of life for many of us. To know what tomorrow holds, next week holds, next month holds, if this relationship will last, if the job will still be there, how long the government benefit will be there to protect us. It's all out of our control because in times of crisis, we become aware that we may be only one breath away from a life-altering or life-ending event that is outside of our control. And as we face a lack of control, when crisis is ravaging our world, we often hear things like, don't worry, God's in control. And for some, that's really comforting. And for others, that's really terrifying. And maybe you've been on the terrifying end of that statement, don't worry, God's in control. You're like, really? There's a disease that is endangering 7 billion people and our most vulnerable can die and God's in control? The suicide rates in 1 month have eclipsed what they normally are in a year. God's in control. People are dying without their loved ones next to them. God's in control. There are starving children. The poor and poverty has been highlighted as many people are crammed into slums, therefore facing the worst this disease has to offer. And God's in control? Maybe you're thinking to yourself, no offense, but in the corporate world, if God was the CEO, he would have been fired by now. Because when I look around, it's a mess and it doesn't make any sense. And to not making any sense, many people will respond with, don't worry, God has a plan. And again, that's comforting for some of us. And for others of us, it's terrifying. Why is that? Because as we start to process that, we start to think, it's all part of God's plan. The horrible things going on in the world are part of God's plan. My child dying prematurely was part of God's plan. Was my child just a pawn sacrificed for some bigger end game that was God's plan? Was my dad ravaged with cancer just to bring the family back together? Was Hitler part of some big plan? If so, I'd like to know what the end game was. Are the atrocities in the news just part of God's plan? He's just pulling the strings, but he's working something out, so don't worry. And then maybe you ask some questions, and I realized that I grew up in a Christian tradition where it was okay to ask questions. It was okay to wrestle. It was okay to cry out to God in confusion, as we see all throughout the scriptures and in the Psalms. But some people didn't have that luxury, and when they asked genuine questions, they were told, don't question God. God's ways are higher than your ways, and maybe you tapped out. I think we're realizing we have a lot to talk about today. Today, we're going to answer some questions. One, is telling people God's in control helpful? And is it even true? And is COVID-19 part of God's plan? If you're not a church person, you're not a Christian, you're tuning in, you're exploring, you're wrestling. Those are some great questions. And I got to be honest, we're going to skim across the surface this week. We're actually going to pause and take another week to keep going with it. And we'll have some other ways that you can dig into some of these questions if you're wrestling with them. But we're so passionate about journeying with you here at Lakeside. But we're just going to jump into it. So here's the first question I want to ask. Where did the narrative of everything being part of God's plan come from? And the idea that God is in control. Is it from the scriptures? Or is it a human bias that we then put on as a lens and read the scriptures through it? That would make sense. Because as human beings, we gravitate towards the control narrative. We are people who are addicted to control. Look at a toddler. The first time you told them no, it's like their whole world melted down. Think of that time your uncle took you out to teach you how to drive. All of a sudden, this person who's been so gentle, all of a sudden was gripping their seatbelt and kicking the floor, looking for the imaginary brake pedal that they wished was there. We love control, and times of crisis reveal how not in control we are. And so the next best thing to being in control is being close friends with someone who is in control. Is it any surprise that we have a theology that says everything happens for a reason? That we've painted a God who is somehow pulling all the strings, and if something bad happens, don't worry, there's something, he's got this, he planned this. And then maybe even a worse theology, that when we have a God who's pulling all the strings, we want a way to influence the God who's pulling all the strings. We want to be in the court of the person who's in control. So we come up with this cause and effect kind of faith, which says, if you do, then God will. And if you don't, then God won't. All throughout human history, humans gravitate towards power and control and being able to choose their own destiny. John chapter 9, verse 9, don't turn there now. We're going to be going all throughout the Jesus' narratives today, but I just want to highlight a few things. John 9:9, as Jesus went along, he saw a blind man from birth. His disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? What are the disciples saying? They're saying, obviously, somebody did something wrong, and this is the result. It's a cause and effect. They did something wrong. God gave them blindness. Jesus responds, neither this man nor his parents sinned, Jesus said. What's Jesus saying? He's like, throw your cause and effect theology out the window. That's not how it works. And then look what Jesus says. But this happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him. What is Jesus doing in this story? Jesus is clarifying that just because something is broken, it doesn't mean that God broke it. But it does present an opportunity for God to intervene and bring healing. Jesus is telling them, throw your cause and effect theology out the window. God didn't do this. God isn't teaching him or his parents a lesson. Blindness was not part of God's plan, but God does plan to heal him. This is significant. Many people have been talking about COVID-19 as God's judgment over the world, or this is God teaching us a lesson, and it's all part of God's plan, and he thought this up, and all that stuff. And there's so many questions that have been coming into the roundtable about, I don't understand what God is doing and why he would send this, and how are we supposed to understand the sickness that God has given us? Okay, and I just want to pause here and just go on a little tangent, but hear me on this. Bad theology always has a verse. Bad theology always has a verse. Jesus was constantly correcting people, religious people who had a verse. They were constantly saying, yeah, but Jesus, it says this and Moses says this. And Jesus is like, yes, but you missed the meaning of it. So when you're trying to make sense of crisis, whether COVID or any other, I don't suggest you start by going through your social media feed and seeing a verse quoted out of context to tell us what's going on. I encourage you to start in the place where I always start, which is Jesus. Let me tell you why. As one ancient Jesus follower in the book of Hebrews, chapter 1, verse 3 said, I love this. He, speaking of Jesus, is the radiance of the glory of God, the exact imprint of his nature. What was this person saying? Jesus is a perfect representation of God. If you want to know what God is like, look at Jesus. And the flip side, I love Bill Johnson says this. He says, anything that you don't find in the person of Jesus, you have grounds to question. Anything that you do not find in the person of Jesus, you have grounds to question. Even things in the Bible. What do you mean? Are you trying to put the Bible against Jesus? No. What I'm saying is Jesus is the perfect representation of what God is like. And if you have an idea from a verse out of context of what God is like, and it doesn't square, in fact, it contradicts what you see in Jesus, you have to understand that maybe you've misunderstood what that is happening. And so today what I want to do is I want to start with Jesus because he's the perfect representation of what God is like. We got way more to talk about than we can cover today, but I just want to focus on Jesus because it's so important. And here's the thing. As you begin to read the life story of Jesus, some of you have spent your whole life doing this. Let me ask this question. How many people did Jesus give a sickness to? How many? None. How many storms did Jesus bless? Last week or a couple weeks ago, Daniel was talking about Jesus calming the storm. Jesus doesn't stand up and say, okay, enough storm. I think they've learned the lesson. No, what does Jesus do to the storm? He rebukes it. He doesn't thank it for teaching people a lesson. He rebukes it. The same language that Jesus uses to what he does to the demonic rebuke, he does to a storm. How many times does Jesus redirect a storm? No, not this village. That's the village that needs to be humbled and taught a lesson. Send the storm there. How about when Jesus tells us what God is like? He tells us a story of a father who waits for a child who's been rebellious, the child representing us who are rebellious and run away from God. And when the child comes back, what does the father say? The father doesn't say, did you get the sickness that I sent you? Did you learn your lesson? Have you been humbled enough? No, the father just runs out, wraps his arms around his son. Hear me on this. Jesus came to eradicate disease, decay, dysfunction, and death, and you will find no instance of Jesus giving any sickness to anyone for any reason, period. Jesus came to eradicate disease, decay, dysfunction, and death, and you will find no instance of Jesus giving any sickness to anyone for any reason, period. To which you're like, wait, what about? And what about? And what about this story and that story? And I'm just like, just pause. We're focusing on Jesus today. Perfect representation of what God is like. Hold that thought for one more moment. Think of when Jesus was teaching his disciples how to pray. It's a long section. Let me just take one part out. He says, when you're asking God for things, here's what I want you to pray. Your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Your will be done. God, your will be done. We're praying. We're asking for your will to be done. Here's a question. If God's in control and everything is part of his plan, why in the world are we praying for his will to be done? Is this just like a make work project? Kind of like my kids who are like, hey, we want to help. And I'm like, but I really don't like it when you help me clean because it just makes a bigger mess. And I just kind of throw some Cheerios in the corner. I'm like, can you guys go clean up those Cheerios? It's like they're not actually helping. I just want them to make them feel a part of it. Is Jesus just kind of making a work project? It's like, just pray that God's will be done and try. No. There must be things going on in the world that aren't God's will, and that's why Jesus tells us, pray that God's will be done. Here's the bottom line. Your pain is not a pawn. Your pain is not a pawn in some cosmic chess game. Your cancer, your grief, your friend's untimely death was not God sacrificing a pawn for a bigger take. Brokenness grieves the Spirit of God. It does not come from the Spirit of God. And I am convinced that many people left the Christian faith unnecessarily because they assumed that God used them as a pawn. Jesus never used anybody. And I just want to invite you, as we dig deeper into this perfect representation of who God is, to journey with us, to discover what God is really like. He's not a God who uses us like pawns in a cosmic chess game. To which you're like, wait, Mark, if God doesn't send sickness and decay and death, is God not in control? Like, if he's not the one doing it, then who's doing it? And that's a great question. And you can see that it's becoming really obvious why we need 2 weeks for this. But here's an interesting thing. Early Jesus followers didn't use the language of God being in control. They used redemption language. I think of Paul, who was often for his Jesus following ways put in prison, beaten to an inch of his life. In Romans 8:28, I'm just taking this verse, we could spend hours in this passage, but I love this verse. He says, and we know that in all things, God works for the good of those who love him. What's Paul saying? God can bring good out of any and all bad. But there's a difference between God orchestrating chaos to bring about a plan and God stepping into the chaos and redeeming it. Now, some of you are a bit concerned as I say that, and I get it because I'm concerned too. So let me just pause. When I say that inflicting evil, sickness, suffering, and death is not part of God's plan, he's not the one doing that, you have alarm bells because you think back to a really hard time in your life. You think of a death, you think of death of a dream or a loved one or a physical ailment, and you look back on that experience and you experience God's healing, loving, powerful presence as I have in those moments. And you were so grateful for what God did in that time. You've actually thanked him for orchestrating and authoring those moments. But we need to clarify, sickness, death, and decay is not from God. But the thing is he can redeem it. He can enter into it and redeem it so fully, we assume that he caused it. He doesn't. And that doesn't change our story. The climax of my grief story and your grief story is that God met us powerfully in the midst of it, but God doesn't orchestrate it. There's a difference between God orchestrating chaos to bring a plan and God stepping into the chaos and redeeming it. Our God is the latter. To which they're thinking, so Mark, then where does this come from? And if God's not the one pulling the strings on every and all bad events that go on in the world, is it the devil? And if so, is God losing? And is God overpowered? Listen, I'm not saying God isn't all-powerful. I'm just saying language is important that we use to define the reality that we're in. Think of it this way. A commander is in charge of their squadron. There's a squadron, is it platoon? I don't know anything about the military, okay? But commander's in charge. There's really nobody higher, right? A common foot soldier is not any more powerful than that person. The commander is in charge, but each individual soldier is in control of their own weapon. The commander, though they have more power, are not in control of that individual's weapon, though they may have given them the weapon. The danger of throwing up our hands and simply saying, well, God's in control, is we ignore the fact that we have been given free will and responsibility. So many crisis moments that we see in the world are actually at the hands of evil in our own hearts that Jesus actually came to heal. So when we talk about it, we don't want to oversimplify it. The ancient Christians had a really good way about talking about the things going on in the world, and they didn't oversimplify it. They didn't just say, well, God's doing everything. He's pulling all the strings, and we have no say in it. And they didn't say, well, it's all the devil. It's all the devil. It's all the devil. They had three different ways of explaining some of the things going on in the world. The world, the flesh, and the devil. Remember, God created the world and gave humans authority and dominion. He created it and then actually, in a sense, kind of gave us some of the strings to actually play our parts. So when we look at the world, when we as humans broke relationship with God, creation broke in that moment. Sickness and death entered the world. And I got to be honest, I don't quite understand it. All I know is when creation is fully restored, those elements of sickness and disease and death are gone. But presently, creation and the world that we live in is broken. There's the world. Then there's the flesh, us. We are also part of the problem. We have free will. We can choose to partner with God or not. God doesn't cause the chaos, but he can bring life out of it. Think of Genesis 50, Joseph and his brothers, right? They sell him into slavery. The brothers sell him into slavery. It doesn't say God was kind of pulling the strings and he had them sell him into slavery. No, but Joseph says, what you intended for evil, God intended for good. You did something, God redeemed it. God redeems the evil in our hearts, but he doesn't cause it. The world, the flesh, what was the third thing? The devil. There's an enemy. There is a war going on. There's a spiritual battle, an invisible war going on, and wars aren't fair. Let's avoid oversimplifying and giving simple answers of things that are way beyond our understanding. How did we end up with COVID-19? I don't know. I know that God does not create disease, decay, destruction, and death. God wrote himself into human history to end those things. and he actually invites us into being a part of the restoration process. Matthew 10:8, this is Jesus' command. Heal the sick, raise the dead, cleanse those who have leprosy. It was a disease that you needed to be in isolation because it could kill you and kill others and drive out demons. Heal the sick, raise the dead, cleanse those who have leprosy, and drive out demons. And Jesus doesn't say, and by the way, if you run out of people to heal, I'll make some more sick. He doesn't say that. He doesn't create sickness and then command us to deal with it. That would be a kingdom divided against itself. Jesus says that's a demonic thing. Let's not sit back and comfort ourselves by saying that the chaos that surrounds us, it's all part of God's plan. That's cruel. In fact, it's pagan. Some countries, and I'm not kidding about this, they actually don't care for the poor because of theology that they have, which is, well, God's teaching this person a lesson, and we don't want to get in the way of God's judgment on this person, this sickness, the fact they lost their spouse, the fact they lost an arm. That's something they deserve. It's a cause and effect faith. Jesus blows up that theology. That's not us. We believe in a God who enters chaos and brings life. And so today I just needed to pause and declare Jesus doesn't bring sickness. He heals it. Everything happens for a reason is different than God can redeem everything. In one case, God creates the chaos. In the other, God heals the chaos. Only one of those narratives is supported by the life of Jesus, the perfect representation of what God is like. God redeems chaos. He doesn't cause it. Your pain is not a pawn in some cosmic chess game. So here's what I want to do. In the last few moments that we have, I just want to pause and talk to us as Jesus followers about some practical stuff. In the midst of the uncertainty, the lack of control that we face, how do we faithfully follow Jesus? Now I realize some of you are like, wait. I have so many questions right now, right? Like, so if God's a healer, why doesn't he heal every storm? Why doesn't he seem to be healing COVID right now? Why is he taking so long? And Mark, what about this verse and this story? And listen, please send your questions and we're going to deal with them in the roundtable. We're going to talk about it next week. But I just needed today to focus on Jesus and declare Jesus is not the author of disease. He heals it. I want us to join him on that journey. So here's a few things to do. Number one, do sit with people in pain and feel their emotion when they feel like they've lost control. It's a ministry of presence. Wow, this is so hard. Acknowledge the sense of loss of control in their life. Feel their pain. Let it grieve you. Jesus wept over cities. We should too. Number two, don't tell people the atrocities they face are part of God's plan. Or tell them that everything happens for a reason and God obviously orchestrated this horrible thing to bring about something better. No, God can redeem it and make it better, but he didn't cause the initial chaos. Love what Kate Ballard said. She said, the only thing worse than telling people everything happens for a reason is then trying to tell them you know what that reason is. Yeah, no, they needed to die because that was the only way that God could think of to get Uncle Buck back in the church and he came for the funeral, so the death, it was just a part of the game. That often maybe we just need to step back and not try and give simple answers to things we don't understand. Job's friends should have been far more quiet than they were. And let's be honest, usually giving simple answers to deep pain is more about our comfort anyways. Number three, do pray with everything in you. Big, bold prayers. Remember one of my professors in Bible college in our pastoral care class, he said, when you show up at the hospital, don't you dare start making excuses before you start to pray of, hey, I just need to warn you, God may not, and I really need to. He said, you're not God's PR manager. Your job is to pray big, bold, mountain-moving prayers. That is your job. We are not God's PR manager, and we do not need to try and make up a narrative of what may be happening. We just pray. The scriptures are full of stories of Jesus teaching us to pray and telling us we can actually influence heaven stepping into our reality when we pray. Let's do that. And as I sign off, lastly, I just want to talk to those of you who've tuned in. Maybe you're exploring. Maybe you're here looking for a faith that fixes the situations that you're in and brings healing. And we believe that our faith is that. But you need to know that the number one healing that you need is healing in your relationship between you and your Creator. We started off today saying we want ultimate control over our lives. And in fact, some of you maybe left the church or were uninterested in church because you didn't want anybody, including God, involved in your life. On the flip side, there are people who leave faith and discount faith because they don't understand why God doesn't take control of this life. The thing we need to realize is it's not about us in ultimate control, and it's not about God in ultimate control. That would just be puppets and strings. The truth is that God wants in our life to do life with us. So much so that God sent his Son to come to earth to show us that love, die on a cross to show us the depths of his forgiveness and radical love. The cross is God's message that I will give anything and everything to be in relationship with you. Jesus surrendered control of his entire life for relationship with you. And I can think of no better time to invite the Creator of the universe to enter your life and begin to make things new.
Well, I don't know where you're at today, but I need you to know that, as Mark said, your pain is not upon. That God is joining you right where you are. That he is pursuing you. That he went to the cross for your life. But he didn't stay there. He rose again. And it's because he rose again that he invites us into eternal life with him, that we may live the life he has called us to. And so maybe you've never made the decision to follow Jesus. Or maybe you want to make a new decision or reconnect or recommit with him. I would invite you to take the opportunity right now to text 226-400-2189. Text the word HOPE. Myself and others will be on the line right now, and we will respond. We will call you back as soon as we can. And we will have a conversation with you about what it means to begin a relationship with Jesus. So wherever you find yourself at today, we pray that your life has been changed and impacted and will continue to move forwards with God. Have a blessed and awesome day.